Somebody said yes, but good. Well, it's the first time that I've seen this book, but I must say, find that the graphic design is by Ante Starcevic, I think, is an extraordinary eye-opener. You seem to have succeeded in doing something that the Hrvatska Stranka Prava has never been able to do, which is to resurrect Ante Starcevic. Anyway, what I have seen, ladies and gentlemen, is, of course, what you have not, that our chairman here was talking about, was this volume of essays in English, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So you'll have to take my word or not. Being sceptical Croats, you don't have to believe anything that any Brit tells you, but anyway, I shall give you my opinions such as they are about the contents of this, and then I'll say some other things that are, I hope, relevant afterwards. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Obnova on the enormous effort that goes into producing something as ambitious as this. It's not just because of the quality of the thinking that is contained in it, but also the skill with which the writers have put their thoughts into order, and also the fact that you have gone to the great effort of putting it into English. I hope that plenty of people read it, but who knows, we never know. We cast bread on the waters, and we don't know which particular fish are going to consume them, but we hope that the fish are fat and useful and yield good conservative results. Anyway, Obnova, rather like Centar za obnovu kulture, is in a long list of groups challenging the prevailing consensus and doing so with very limited resources. Sometimes such groups win, sometimes they lose, sometimes they finish up in jail, sometimes they finish up in all sorts of places where they don't want to go. We are more optimistic because Croatia today has a lot of things wrong with it, but it does not have a ruthless system of state repression as it did have under communism. But I think it is true to say that, and this is the background to the challenge that's faced by all of us when we produce material like this, Croatia is what I would call a controlled democracy. It's a top-down system in which those who enjoy life at the political and administrative and judicial top make all the decisions, do not wish to have those decisions challenged by those who are not at the top. And of course most ordinary people are not at the top. So we have, as over the two recent attempts to have a referendum, we have the main parties getting together with a submissive and subordinate media saying this is quite out of the question, completely out of the question, that actually the general public should have the main say in deciding who should be members of the Sabor. What an extraordinary idea, what a revolutionary thought, quite unacceptable. Or indeed that perhaps the Istanbul Convention, with an idea of a gender ideology which is totally unacceptable to most Croatian people, of course the Croats are not going to have any chance of choosing that. And just in order that there shouldn't be any doubt about it, Mr. Božinović has just signed you all up to the Marrakesh Treaty, and of course nobody's even going to talk to you about that, nobody's even going to report it in the press. So yes, we live in a controlled democracy. In the Czech Republic recently, where we had a very useful conference actually, we were discussing the themes, two central themes I think for us conservatives, of nationhood and culture, national identity and cultural values. Now, the Czechs are very fine people, and their Czech conservatives are very good on economics, and much better than Croats are on economics. Croats don't understand anything about economics, most of them anyway. But the Czechs are very, very uneasy about getting into these central questions of national identity and cultural values. And they said, two of them said to me, they said, well, if we do this, we might be called racists. We might be called xenophobes. People might be unpleasant to us. And I said, you really shouldn't bother. I said, it's fun to be insulted, as long as you have friends. And actually, the more insults fly, the more friends you find. And that's why we conservatives, who are always seem to be in a minority, I think are quite happy people. There are many Croats who are on happy pills, but I don't think most Croats, most conservatives are. Well, this collection of essays, and this actually is more relevant than you may think, this collection of essays, as I say, is extremely interesting, and I'm going to go through it point by point with my observations, which may be true or false or boring or interesting, but there we are, that's what I think. Well, the first of these essays is by Professor Mario Grčević, and it's about language, and particularly the history of the manipulation of language. And of course, language in your country, my country, since I'm a citizen of this country, has been manipulated from a very early stage in the 19th century by, in the context of the work of Vuk Karadžić and his many supporters, actually, and like-minded linguistic experts in Croatia too. And Vuk's well-known slogan, Srbi svi i svuda, Srbi svi i svuda, do actually show exactly what all this was about. And then, of course, the next point that comes up with this manipulation is much closer to the present day. It relates to the attempt to create a Serbo-Croatian language, which had never existed, and it is now clear, despite the wishes of some odd left-wing Croatian intellectuals, it's never going to exist. It is now, it is clear that what was actually happening in the 60s and 70s, the 60s mainly, was a last gasp attempt to create a Yugoslav nation in order to fit into a Yugoslav state. And so these are extremely interesting themes. And Professor Grčević says at one point, he says, language is the carrier of culture and it is part of the culture. And those two things are very good points, I think. And this seems to me to get the balance dead right. So that it's important, language is important, but that one shouldn't obsess over it. Our friend Professor Sunic, that I think I first and last met in Britain. I think it was in Britain some years ago.
I guess about 20 years back.
20 years, yeah. Well, you look better every year. Something is good. Something is good, that it must be your beliefs and your strength in your heart. So, Professor Sunic has written, in fact it's an interview, and it's about various themes, culture, and this theme of culture, cultural hegemony, echoing, I think, they're not talking about Gramsci in some ways, as a kind of sort of answer to Gramsci, that's how I read this, and suggesting, I think, that the right, however we define us, should be trying to achieve some kind of cultural hegemony. And I heard from earlier that this is one of the themes you pursue. And I want to come back to that, because I agree that the right does not have cultural hegemony, but I have some doubts about exactly whether the right should be seeking, at least directly, cultural hegemony. Now, the great white chief of the evening, Marko Parađić, discusses in his piece ideology in the novels of Michel Houellebecq, of whom, I'm afraid, I knew little or nothing. But I also noted that Mr. Parađić discusses a phenomenon which you describe as liberal socialism. At least that's how it comes across in English. And his assertion that, and I quote, the majority in our society live in a false dichotomy of those notions of liberalism and socialism, so that both notions represent two diametrically opposing notions, and which I think is a view that you disagree with. You think that there is more in common, very much more in common, these two views have than this suggests. And this echoes, to my mind, what Richard Legutko is talking about when he talks about liberal ideology as liberal democracy as an ideology in that great book, which in English is called The Demon in Democracy, which we hope to get, which we are going to get published here. Now this again is an important point, and I partly agree with it, but not completely. Now Mr. Leo Maric, I don't know whether he's here, I don't know, he isn't. Anyway, but he writes about multiculturalism and identity, and specifically the fate of this Black Pete, he's called, who was Djed Mraz's Brage's evil and black mythological opposite number from the Netherlands. And the international community's campaign against poor old Black Pete would, I think, be funny if it didn't come from people on the left who congenitally suffer from a grand sense of humour failure. Anyway, that's good for you. Mario Thomas, don't know, again, I don't know you, so if you're here...
From Osijek. From
Osijek, well, perhaps it's an Osijek. Anyway, so he discusses Julius Evola's analysis of the 60s cultural revolution, and by implication other social and cultural revolutions, and describes, as Evola puts it, how to ride the tiger. I think it's cavalcari, il tigre, or whatever language it is. Anyway, riding the tiger, it's a good notion. Not a very happy activity. And I must say that this analysis by this Evola was new to me, and I found it particularly interesting. Now, as the Maurice Chevalier's song says, I remember it well, because this was the period that got me into politics, or at least fascinated by politics, when I knew that I was a political being. I think I'm more or less a human being, but I'm certainly a political being. Now, perhaps the state and the university authorities of the time had to try to ride this tiger, because the essence of the argument is that you have to get onto the top of this tiger, hold, I don't know, its ears or whatever you have to hold with a tiger. It doesn't have a mane, does it? So you have to hold its ears, presumably. And you have to try and stay on until circumstances change and you can somehow live without that tiger about to eat you. Now, in order to do that, the suggestion is you have to make all sorts of tactical compromises while trying to remember that and we're talking now about the late 60s, that these self-important young ignoramuses who were causing so much trouble had in fact nothing coherent to say about life or indeed anything else, which is the truth. Well, I remember this, as I say, and because in 1968, my instinct at the time was not to ride any tigers. I recoiled from this revolution, and I didn't want to ride anything. I wanted to shoot that tiger. And I suppose I can say that I've been trying to shoot revolutionary tigers ever since, frequently missing, and I shall continue to shoot revolutionary tigers until I'm put in a box in Miragoy. Anyway, Mate Simic discusses Emil, so he might be able to correct my translation. I suspect it's Cioran, the Romanian. Now, he discusses this man, Emil Cioran, and cultural pessimism. Now, I know a certain amount about pessimism, but I didn't know anything about Emil Cioran. And I can see why Mr. Simic is intrigued by him, but I find this Cioran, from this account, a pestilential, self-absorbed, depressive and depressing intellectual of the sort one sometimes still encounters and wishes that one didn't have to. Now, I'm not at all surprised that Mr. Simic says that Cioran treated himself for insomnia and depression. I shall return to this theme of depression in a minute, if I may. As a historian trying to get to grips with modern Croatian history for a new book that I'm writing, I found Marko Rajic's discussion of Croatia under the Austro-Hungarian Empire extremely helpful, and I even got an important, useful reference from it. And a proper understanding of what's called Austro-Hungarian dualism is indeed very important for Croats who are historically minded, and also, I think, important because the suggestion that there was a possibility of trialism, and any of you who have read Ivo Pilar's great book will understand exactly why he thought that some kind of trialism might be possible, that these are important issues, and they're issues which by one way, means or another, are quite deeply ingrained in the Croatian historical consciousness, even among people who would not consider themselves particularly historians. And I think that it's worth saying here that nationalism and communism, which seem to be both opposites they actually agree on many of these sort of historical interpretations. The nationalist and communist interpretations of Croatian history are similar in some respects, in that they're both anti-Italian, actually, that's a different word, but very anti-Hungarian and very anti the dual monarchy. And I think the Hungarians, including poor Ban Kun Herdovari, have more to be said for them than most people in Croatia think, particularly when you consider what turned out to be the alternative, which was Karađorđević, Yugoslavia after 1918. Well, the next essay is Marina Skelin's discussion of European regionalism and of the terminology used when discussing the regional units into which your and my European masters wish to fit Croatia. It's very timely, and I have to say that I'm even more unhappy with the notion of the West Balkans, that she examines, perhaps even more unhappy about that than she is. Antonio Mock provides, as our friend here said, what seems to me a very absolutely correct interpretation of the Croatian Homeland War, rightly observing that it was a war of national liberation and not, at least in any ordinary sense, a civil war. And of course, the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina has elements of both. It's much more complicated. And again, I gained some useful references that I intend ruthlessly to use for my own purposes from this article. And finally, Mr. Tomo Hunjak tells us about the neofolk and explains that they probably rightly, are not right-wing extremists. Now, I show my age when I say that I have never heard of these neofolk at all. It sounds a little like a place in England called Norfolk, but I don't think it's got anything to do with them at all. I would probably recognise these neofolk. I might even smell them, and I would certainly cross the street to avoid them. But anyway, I'm sure Mr. Hunjak is right in his analysis. So now I want to indulge myself and make 5 pretty short points which are relevant, I hope they're relevant, to the themes that I have marginally touched on and that your distinguished contributors have also addressed in much greater detail. And the first point is an unlikely one. The first point is about hope. Hope. Well, we conservatives reject the idea of progress. And we're right to see that many things described as progressive are in fact regressive, particularly regarding behaviour, values and institutions. But we have to guard against despair. And this is a very big temptation because despair can be quite aesthetically pleasing. And it's very dangerous because it disables us, this despair, and it guarantees in the end victories to our enemies. I'm not keen on cynicism, and I'm deeply distrustful of paganism. And I don't like to see any elements of that emerging in any way on the right. I've already mentioned the interesting case of poor Mr. Chora. But I'd also like to mention 2 others that stick in my mind. And the first is that of the nationalist Japanese novelist Yukio Mishima, another sort of right-wing pin-up in some quarters, who committed harikiri, a pretty disgusting business, after his crazy coup attempt in 1970. And then more recently, another case that you may well remember, as I do, the French traditionalist Catholic historian Dominique Venner, who shot himself beside the high altar of Notre Dame de Paris in 2013 to protest against gay marriage and other matters. Well, we should pray for their souls, but we should, in this sense, spit on their memories and shun their example. And we should do so because we should remain hopeful and we should remain